In the shadow of Maple Creek, a town that once thrived on secrets whispered in dark corners, a mother's desperate search for her missing daughter collides with a decades-old conspiracy that threatens to shatter everything she believed to be true. When a long-hidden key falls into her hands, Sarah Carter is forced to confront the ghosts of her past and the chilling truth that power and corruption run deeper than she ever imagined. As the echoes of betrayal ring through the town's quiet streets, Sarah must race against time to save her daughter from the darkness that has claimed so many before. But with each step closer to the truth, she finds herself in a deadly game where the stakes are nothing less than life itself. Will Sarah expose the sins of the powerful before they silence her forever? Or will the secrets of Maple Creek claim her and Emily for good? Join us in this gripping tale of courage, mystery, and a mother's unwavering fight to bring her child back from the shadows. The early autumn air in Maple Creek, Oregon, carried a hint of brisk coolness as Sarah Carter completed the final stretch of her daily morning run. The town clock tower chimed exactly 8:01 a.m. as she slowed her pace, her breath falling into the measured rhythm she had cultivated for the past 8 long years. At 47, she still clung to this ritual with a quiet intensity. It was the only thing that had held her together since James and Emily vanished. Her husband, James Carter, had been 45 when he disappeared, a beloved figure in town as its mayor, and her daughter Emily was just 10, full of curiosity and laughter. They were last seen leaving the Maple Creek Country Club for a quick round of golf, a trip that should have ended with them back home for dinner, but instead, it ended in a void of silence. Witnesses recalled seeing them stop at a convenience store for cold drinks and snacks before heading out, but from there, they seemed to have vanished completely. The first 2 years following their disappearance had been a blur of dread for Sarah. Each morning, she would wake up to a crushing panic that pinned her to the bed, her heart racing in the darkness before dawn. Local police had mounted a massive search effort. Volunteers combed through the dense woods and riverbanks, but nothing turned up. No bodies, no ransom demands, no sightings, just an empty house and a haunting uncertainty that metastasized in her soul. Those daily runs had started as therapy. Over time, they became more than just a routine. They became her meditation, a small sanctuary that allowed her to quiet the racing questions and find the strength to face another day. This morning, however, Sarah had chosen a different route. She changed her path every few months, partly to break the monotony, but mostly because she had learned that even comfort could be a prison. Today's path took her past the imposing limestone walls of St. Michael's Church. The early morning light painted the stone in soft gold, almost serene in its beauty. But as she drew closer, a ripple of unease gripped her. Police cruisers clustered at the entrance, lights silent, but their presence unmistakable. Construction vehicles were parked at odd angles, as if hastily abandoned. A couple stood by the yellow police tape, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of whatever drama had unfolded inside. Sarah slowed her steps, heart quickening with a cold dread she had come to know all too well. "What's happening here?" she asked a woman who seemed only too eager to share. The woman turned, her face bright with the kind of morbid excitement that tragedy often evoked. "We're not sure," she said, almost breathless. "They started renovations on the church yesterday. You know, fixing up the old bell tower and the floors. But this morning, something happened. Something they found, maybe." Sarah nodded absently, but her mind was already racing ahead, past the gossip. Her eyes drifted to the controlled chaos near the church doors, uniformed officers moving with brisk, deliberate steps, not the relaxed gait of routine work. And then she saw him. Detective Mark Ellis. He'd been the lead investigator when James and Emily first went missing. Seeing him here now, 8 years later, made her stomach clench. Detective Ellis saw her at that moment, and his expression shifted. Relief and something else, something graver, flitted across his features as he excused himself from a conversation and strode over. "Mrs. Carter," he said, a little breathless. "I'm so glad you're here. We've been trying to reach you. Called your house, even sent an officer." Sarah swallowed hard, her voice catching. "I was on my run. What is it, Mark? What's happened?" He looked back at the church, then met her eyes again. "We've found something. I'm afraid it's related to your husband's case. We need you to come with us. We need you to help identify what we've uncovered." The words fell between them like a weight, and Sarah's legs seemed to move of their own accord, following Mark past the police line and into the cool, cavernous interior of the church. Their footsteps echoed across marble floors as they made their way down side corridors she had never seen before, deep into the bowels of the building. The air grew mustier the further they went, the scent of damp stone and old wood filling her lungs. At last, they emerged into a small chamber beneath the church's nave, where the floor had been partially demolished. The gaping hole in the ground was raw and jagged, revealing a darkness that seemed to yawn with secrets. Around it, workers in dusty overalls and priests in their white collars stood in small knots, their faces pale. Detective Ellis paused at the edge of the pit, turning back to her with the same grave gentleness he had worn 8 years before. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know this is going to be hard." Sarah stepped forward, peering into the void. An old oil barrel, half buried in the dirt, lay exposed. Its metal was rusted, the lid sealed with concrete, as if someone had gone to great lengths to make sure it would never be opened. Mark's partner, Officer Hank Jones, appeared beside them, holding out a surgical mask. "You should put this on, Mrs. Carter," he said. Sarah's hands trembled as she fitted the mask over her face, her breath now shallow and quick. She knew, in the marrow of her bones, what they would find inside that barrel. But knowing was one thing, seeing was another. Mark and Hank worked together, prying at the lid with crowbars until it gave way with a dull groan. The smell hit her first, a wave of decay and earth that turned her stomach. And then she saw. A scream tore from her throat. James. Even after 8 years, she knew the clothes he wore that day. A faded blue polo, khaki pants she had ironed for him that morning, and his brown leather shoes, scuffed at the toes. His body, though shrunken and mummified by time and the confines of that barrel, was unmistakably him. Sarah's knees buckled and strong hands caught her before she could fall into the darkness. The mask was pulled from her face as she gasped for air, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Breathe," Hank whispered, his hand warm on her shoulder. Deep breaths. For 8 years she had lived with the question of whether James was alive or dead. Now she had the answer, and it crashed over her like a black wave. Through her sobs, a single word clawed its way out. "Emily, did you find my daughter?" Mark's face tightened. "No sign of Emily, I'm sorry. Just this." Sarah shook her head in disbelief, another wave of grief and questions rising up. "Where is she? My baby girl, where is she?" Mark's voice was low but urgent. "Sarah, I know this is overwhelming, but with what we found today, we might finally be able to find out what happened to both of them. Whoever did this is still out there." She forced herself to look into that barrel one last time, to confirm the terrible truth. "Yes," she said hoarsely. "That's James Carter, my husband." Mark nodded, already motioning for the forensics team to move in. "We'll need to conduct a full examination," he said gently. "The body's condition suggests some natural mummification, but we'll do an autopsy to determine cause of death. We'll also need dental records, anything you can provide. It's been a long time, and the more we can verify, the better." Sarah felt her voice crack as she asked, "Can't you just use DNA? It's more reliable." Mark hesitated. "DNA testing is still new. Only a few labs in the country have that capability, and it's expensive, slow. The technology is not quite there yet for most local cases. We'll do everything we can, but it may take time." She nodded numbly, tears still streaking her face. "Do what you have to. Just, please, give him a proper burial when you're done." Mark's eyes softened. "You have my word, Sarah. He was the mayor of this town. He deserves that respect. And remember, there's still hope for Emily. She might still be out there." As they climbed the stairs back to the main level of the church, the morning sun was streaming through the stained glass, painting rainbows on the walls. But to Sarah, it felt obscene, too bright, too alive for the weight of the grief she carried. She barely noticed the approach of the town's current mayor, Alan Prescott, until his hand was on her arm. "Sarah," he said smoothly, his voice full of practiced sympathy. "I heard what happened. I'm so sorry. James was a good man. He inspired me to serve this community. If there's anything the city can do, anything at all." Sarah could only nod, too spent for pleasantries. She excused herself, needing to sit alone in one of the pews, to let the flood of memory and loss wash over her. The door at the back of the church creaked open softly, and Hank Jones appeared in the entryway. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "we're ready to take you home now, if you'd like." She rose on legs that felt as fragile as glass. Outside, Alan Prescott offered again, his hand on the small of her back. "Let me drive you home," he said. "It's the least I can do." Sarah hesitated but finally nodded. She was too drained to refuse. "Thank you," she murmured. As she stepped into his car, a sleek black sedan with polished chrome that gleamed in the sun, she felt a shiver. James had always driven a modest pickup, saying that taxpayer money should be spent on schools and roads, not on luxury. But today, none of that seemed to matter. She settled into the leather seat, the smell of new car and expensive cologne filling her lungs. She closed her eyes for just a moment, but the image of James, forever sealed in that barrel, was burned behind her eyelids. Outside the window, the town of Maple Creek rolled by in a blur, unchanged and yet irrevocably transformed. The sun was climbing higher in the sky as Alan Prescott's sedan rolled along the quiet streets of Maple Creek. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on Sarah Carter like a shroud, making the world outside the window seem distant and unreal. Alan drove with careful, deliberate movements, his profile calm and composed, but Sarah could see the faint lines of strain at the corners of his mouth. "You know," Alan said after a moment, his tone almost conversational, "James was an inspiration to me, the way he cared about this town. It made me want to follow in his footsteps." Sarah didn't respond. Her thoughts were too crowded with memories of James, his laughter, the way he used to hold Emily on his shoulders during the 4th of July parade, the quiet moments they shared over coffee in the mornings. Those memories seemed to rise up around her now, a bittersweet fortress against the harsh reality that had come crashing down in the church basement. Alan cleared his throat, glancing at her as he slowed the car for a stop sign. "I imagine you'll want to retrieve any personal items James left behind, his journals, notes from his office. We made sure everything was secured after the investigation ended. I can help you get them if you'd like." Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes narrowed slightly. "His journals?" Alan gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "Yes. After the police went through everything, the records were returned to City Hall, standard procedure. Some of those documents had to be reviewed for confidentiality, but I believe there's a box with his personal notes. If you'd like, we could stop by City Hall now. It might give you some peace to have them back in your hands." Sarah hesitated, a flicker of instinct telling her to be cautious. But then she thought of James's careful, looping handwriting in those leather-bound notebooks, the record of his thoughts and worries, the private pieces of him that she had always treasured. "Yes," she said finally. "I'd like to have them, please." Alan nodded and turned the car down a side street that led to the old City Hall building, a square limestone structure that had been the seat of local government for more than half a century. The sign out front was newly repainted, but the heavy oak doors still bore the same scuffs and scratches James had made when he pushed them open every morning. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon oil and paper. The front clerk, Mrs. Wilson, looked up in surprise when Alan and Sarah entered. She was a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair and a kind face that creased with sympathy the moment she recognized Sarah. "Oh, Mrs. Carter," she murmured. "I'm so sorry for your loss. I can't believe, after all these years—" "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson," Sarah said softly, her voice thick. Alan stepped forward, his tone brisk but polite. "Mrs. Wilson, we're looking for James Carter's personal effects, any journals or notes he might have kept here after the investigation. Would you mind showing us where they're stored?" "Of course, sir," Mrs. Wilson said, pulling a large ring of keys from her drawer. "Follow me." She led them down a narrow hallway to a locked archive room at the back of the building. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glow over rows of metal shelving packed with dusty cardboard boxes. Mrs. Wilson navigated the maze with practiced ease, stopping at a section marked 1975-1985. She pulled down a box labeled J. Carter, Personal, in black marker. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for it. She remembered packing some of those notebooks herself on the morning James was sworn in as mayor, wanting him to have them close by for reference. The sight of them now felt like a lifeline to a man who had become a memory. Mrs. Wilson stepped back respectfully. "I'll give you a moment," she said, disappearing back up the hallway. Alan lifted the box carefully, his fingers brushing hers for a moment, his skin clammy despite the coolness of the archive room. I'll carry it out for you, he offered. Sarah said nothing, watching him as he carried the box like a precious relic. Back in the bright lobby, Alan set it down on a small table and motioned for her to sit. She sank into the chair, the weight of the past 8 years pressing down on her as she opened the box. Inside, the familiar leather covers of James's journals stared back at her, each one carefully labeled with dates in his neat handwriting. There were also a few manila folders with city council minutes, budget notes, and a small stack of Polaroid photos, snapshots of community events. James beaming beside children with ice cream sticky fingers, Emily clinging to his leg. Sarah ran her fingers over the cover of the most recent journal, 1980. A coffee stain on the corner made her throat tighten with memory. She flipped it open to the first page, James's looping script filling the lines. February 12th, 1980. I fear something has taken root here in Maple Creek, something deeper and darker than I imagined. I've seen too much to pretend it isn't real. Licenses granted to businesses with no oversight, shipments arriving at odd hours under false names. There are whispers of connections to the Reynosa cartel. I'm documenting everything, but I fear what might happen if these pages are discovered. Sarah's breath caught. She'd known James was worried about corruption in Maple Creek, but she hadn't realized how deep his fears ran. She turned the page, her eyes skimming lines that spoke of shadowy deals and political favors, of men who operated in darkness and wore polite smiles in the daylight. Alan hovered behind her, his hands folded in front of him, his expression carefully neutral. "Sarah," he said after a moment, his voice gentle but edged with something she couldn't quite name. "I know this is a lot to take in, but if there's anything you find in there that you think might help the police, anything that could bring closure to this, please let me know. We all want justice for James." Sarah closed the journal slowly, her fingers curling around it. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I will." Alan offered a small, practiced smile. "Good. Let me help you take this to your car." They stepped out into the bright noon sun, the box of James's memories heavy in Sarah's arms. As they walked, Alan's hand reached out to steady her, but she pulled away gently. She didn't want his comfort, not now. Not when questions burned hotter than any grief. At the car, Alan hesitated, looking down at the box as if it held answers he desperately wanted. "Sarah," he said quietly, "if you need anything at all, you know how to reach me." Sarah met his gaze, her mind already racing ahead. "Yes," she said. "I know." As Alan drove her back to her home on the edge of town, Sarah stared out the window, the weight of the journals pressing into her lap. The words James had written echoed in her mind, each line a breadcrumb leading her deeper into a forest of secrets. She would read every word, follow every clue. Whatever lay at the heart of Maple Creek's darkness, she would find it. She owed that much to James and to Emily, wherever her daughter might still be. That afternoon, Sarah sat alone at her kitchen table, the box of James's journals and notes open in front of her. Outside, the early autumn sun cast a golden glow across the yard, but she barely noticed. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the old wall clock, these small domestic sounds seemed to fade, replaced by the louder, more urgent rhythm of her heart. She picked up the journal again, her fingers tracing the grooves of the embossed leather cover. The entries were dated in neat, methodical lines, each one a window into the mind of a man she had loved for half her life. Each page she turned brought a new flicker of understanding and a deeper sense of dread. March 3rd, 1980. Alan Prescott has announced his candidacy for mayor. His platform of deregulation is nothing but a thin veil for corruption. I see it in the way he dismisses safety inspections and environmental concerns. There are men who want this town to be their personal playground, and Alan is their willing accomplice. Sarah's throat tightened. She could almost hear James's voice in the words, the quiet conviction that had always steadied her when the world felt too chaotic. April 15th, 1980. The threats have started. Anonymous calls to the house at night. The rattling of the windows. Emily doesn't understand. I tell her it's the wind, but I see the fear in her eyes. If something happens to me, these journals will be the only record of the truth. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, swallowing hard. Emily. She could still remember the way her daughter had giggled when James lifted her high on his shoulders, the way her small hands clutched at his hair, her laughter ringing through the yard like music. But Emily was still missing, and Sarah knew now that James had been closer to the truth than anyone had realized. She flipped forward, her eyes scanning entry after entry, piecing together the web of collusion James had uncovered. Licenses for warehouses granted under false names, shipments arriving at the old freight yard in the dead of night, cash payments funneled through shell companies, all connected by a thread that led straight to Alan Prescott. Sarah's pulse quickened as she read. Alan, his calm, measured voice, his practiced kindness. How much of it had been a lie? A sudden knock at the door startled her, the sound sharp in the quiet house. She quickly closed the journal, her breath catching. Through the window, she saw a young man in a police uniform, Officer Hank Jones. His expression was polite, but his eyes shifted just a fraction too quickly as he scanned the living room behind her. "Mrs. Carter," he said when she opened the door, his tone all practiced concern. "Detective Ellis asked me to check in. We're coordinating with the county crime lab to process the remains found at the church. I also wanted to see if you had anything else, any other documents that might be helpful to the investigation." Sarah hesitated. She didn't trust the easy smile Hank wore, the casual way his fingers tapped at his belt. "I'm still going through James's journals," she said cautiously. "If I find anything, I'll call Detective Ellis directly." Hank's smile froze for a heartbeat before it returned, even brighter. "Of course, Mrs. Carter, of course. Just know we're all here to help. The sooner we have everything, the sooner we can find answers." She nodded, stepping back and closing the door slowly. Only when the latch clicked did she let out the breath she had been holding. She didn't trust Hank. Not after what she'd read. She returned to the table, her mind spinning. She needed to be careful. She needed to keep these journals safe. She pulled out a small notepad from the kitchen drawer and began jotting down the names James had mentioned. Warehouses, shell companies, men who had once been pillars of the community and now were shadows in the dark. She underlined the name Alan Prescott 3 times. As she worked, she noticed the brass key on the table, the one that had fallen from Alan's car that morning. She picked it up, turning it over in her hand. The symbol carved into its head, the ancient Cairo mark, still sent a chill down her spine. What did this key open? And why was Alan so desperate to keep it hidden? She remembered the way the caretaker at St. Michael's had looked at her when she asked about the renovations, the way his eyes had darted away. She remembered the small locked door at the back of the church, the one she had always assumed was just a storage closet. Maybe it was time to find out. Sarah changed into a dark jacket and jeans, slipping the key into her pocket. She grabbed her pepper spray from the kitchen counter, an old habit that had started when James first became mayor and the threats began. She paused at the door, her hand on the knob. Outside, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the lawn. In the gathering dusk, Maple Creek seemed to hold its breath. She would not wait for answers to come to her. She would find them herself. The air grew colder as Sarah approached St. Michael's Church once more. The setting sun cast long, golden shafts of light through the tall pines that lined the graveyard, their shadows pooling like dark rivers across the ground. She paused at the edge of the walkway, the heavy stone walls of the church looming before her like a fortress. A part of her hesitated. This was sacred ground, a place of worship and comfort for the townspeople. But tonight, Sarah felt only a cold curiosity, a determination to uncover the truth that had been hidden beneath these stones for too long. She slipped inside through a side door that stood slightly ajar. The air was cool and musty, carrying the faint scent of incense and old wood. The nave was empty, the pews bathed in the last light of day filtering through the stained glass windows. Sarah's footsteps were muffled on the thick carpet runner. As she made her way down the aisle, the silence pressed in around her, heavy and expectant. She paused at the door near the back, the one that James had once said was used for storage during Christmas pageants. The key in her pocket felt warm against her fingers. She pulled it out, her breath catching as she slipped it into the lock. It turned smoothly, with a soft click that echoed in the stillness. The door swung open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. A draft of cold air rose to meet her, carrying with it the scent of earth and something older, something that smelled of secrets long buried. Sarah hesitated only for a heartbeat before stepping through. She pulled the door shut behind her, plunging herself into a darkness that was near total. She switched on a small flashlight she kept, clipped to her keychain, the beam of light cutting through the gloom in thin, trembling slices. The stone steps were worn smooth by countless feet over the decades. She moved slowly, testing each tread before trusting it with her weight. Her breath echoed in the narrow space, each exhale a soft rush that seemed far too loud in the stillness. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a small chamber, walls of rough-hewn stone, a dirt floor covered in a thin layer of dust. Old wooden shelves lined one wall, stacked with broken hymnals and battered candlesticks. But it was what lay in the center of the room that caught her breath. A thick slab of stone, crudely mortared into place, stood out against the older walls. The mortar was fresh, newer than the rest of the room by decades. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She reached out, running her fingertips over the rough surface. Why would someone seal off a part of this ancient basement? Her flashlight beam fell on something glinting near the base of the wall, a small brass hinge, half buried in the dirt. A door, hidden behind the newer stone. Sarah knelt, her fingers tracing the outline of the concealed door. Her mind raced. James's journals, the key with the ancient symbol. Alan's carefully controlled expression when she'd asked about the past. She didn't have the tools to pry the stone away tonight, but she knew one thing for certain. This was no random renovation. Someone had hidden something down here, something they didn't want found. A noise behind her made her freeze, a soft scrape, like a footstep on stone. She turned, her flashlight beam darting across the walls. Nothing but shadows. But the silence had changed, grown thicker, charged with something that prickled the back of her neck. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. No answer came. She stood slowly, her heart thundering in her chest. She had to get out. She needed to tell Mark Ellis what she'd found, before whoever was watching decided she'd seen too much. She climbed the stairs faster than she'd come down, every creak and groan of the old steps a gunshot in her ears. When she reached the top, she paused, listening. The church above was still silent, but her instincts screamed that she wasn't alone. Sarah slipped out the side door, the fresh air of the evening hitting her face like a slap. She didn't look back as she hurried to her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. She didn't know how deep this darkness ran, but she knew one thing for certain. She was done being afraid. She started the engine, the headlights cutting twin tunnels through the growing night. She would go to Detective Ellis. She would show him James's journals, the key, and tell him about the hidden door. She would not be silenced, not now, not ever. As she pulled away from the church, Sarah's thoughts were a storm. In the beam of her headlights, the town of Maple Creek looked the same as it always had. Quaint houses, neat lawns, warm lights in kitchen windows. But she knew now that beneath that veneer, something terrible had festered for years, and she was ready to bring it to light. The night air in Maple Creek felt colder than usual as Sarah Carter drove towards the police station, her mind a storm of questions and half-formed theories. The journals she had read so far, James's notes about Alan Prescott, the threats, the hidden deals, swirled in her thoughts like shards of glass, cutting at her calm resolve. She pulled up to the small brick building that housed the Maple Creek Police Department, its front lights a warm glow against the encroaching darkness. She paused for a moment in the car, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She knew she couldn't afford to let her fear show, not now when the truth was so close. Inside, the station was quiet. A young desk sergeant named Officer Martinez looked up from a stack of paperwork, his expression polite but weary. "Mrs. Carter," he greeted her. "Detective Ellis isn't here at the moment. He's out following up on some leads at the church." Sarah's shoulders tensed. "Do you know when he'll be back?" Martinez shrugged. "He didn't say. Could be an hour, maybe more. Is there something I can help you with in the meantime?" Sarah hesitated, her instincts prickling. She didn't want to trust anyone else with what she'd found. She thought about the way Hank Jones had watched her that afternoon, his too eager smile, his eyes flicking over her living room like a hawk's. "I'll wait," she said finally. "It's important." The young officer nodded, gesturing to the waiting area. Sarah sat down on one of the hard plastic chairs, the journals clutched tight in her lap. Around her, the muted buzz of the station seemed both comforting and suffocating. Minutes ticked by like hours. Through the glass window in the office door, she watched officers come and go, the hum of radios crackling in the background. She thought about the key in her pocket, the ancient Cairo symbol gleaming in the dim light of the church basement. What secrets did it unlock? And how far would someone go to keep those secrets buried? The front door swung open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Alan Prescott. He was dressed in a dark overcoat, his hair perfectly in place, his eyes scanning the room until they settled on her. "Sarah," he said warmly, as if they'd merely run into each other at the grocery store. "I'm glad to see you here. I heard about the discovery at St. Michael's. Terrible, just terrible." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Yes," she said evenly. "It is." Alan stepped closer, his hands folded in front of him. "I came to check on the investigation, see if there's anything I can do to help. You know how much James meant to me, to all of us." Sarah studied him carefully. In the warm glow of the station lights, he looked every bit the concerned leader, calm, polished, sympathetic. But she remembered the journals, the names James had written down, the deals, the threats. "I'm sure you did," she said softly, her voice carrying an edge. Alan's smile faltered for a heartbeat, then returned. "I know you're still processing everything, but if you find anything in those papers, anything that might be connected to, well, all of this, please let me know. We're all on the same side here." Sarah forced a small smile. "Of course," she lied. Alan's eyes flickered to the box of journals in her lap. "May I?" he asked, already reaching out. She pulled them closer to her chest, her fingers tightening around the worn leather covers. "They're personal," she said quietly. "James's thoughts. I'd like to go through them myself first." Alan's hand paused in midair, then slowly dropped back to his side. His expression was unreadable, but something cold passed through his eyes. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Take your time. I just wanted to make sure you're getting the support you need. This town owes James that much." Sarah said nothing, and after a moment, Alan stepped back. "I should be going," he said, his tone gentle but final. "If you need anything, anything at all, you know how to reach me." She watched him leave, her heart hammering in her chest. The door swung shut behind him with a soft thud, and the noise of the station seemed to rush back in around her. A moment later, Officer Martinez approached, his expression cautious. "Mrs. Carter, if you'd like to wait in one of the interview rooms, it might be more private. Sometimes the front can get busy." Sarah hesitated. "I'd rather stay here," she said. The young officer nodded, though she saw the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "Of course. Let me know if you need anything." Sarah settled back in the chair, her mind racing. She had seen it in Alan's eyes, the moment when his careful mask had slipped, just for a second. He wanted those journals, needed them, and that told her more than any confession ever could. She would wait for Mark Ellis. She would show him everything, and she would not let Alan Prescott or anyone else silence her. Outside, the wind rattled the glass in the old window frames. In the distance, the town clock began to chime the hour, each strike a low, measured heartbeat in the darkness. Sarah tightened her grip on the journals. She didn't know how deep this conspiracy ran, but she knew one thing for certain. She would see it through to the end. Sarah left the police station just as the town clock struck 10, the chime echoing through the quiet streets of Maple Creek like a somber reminder of how late it had gotten and how far she had already gone. She clutched the journals to her chest as she stepped out into the cold night, the brass key heavy in her pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the secrets she was only beginning to understand. She had wanted to wait for Detective Ellis, but the longer she sat in that hard plastic chair, the more she felt the walls closing in, the more she felt the gaze of Alan Prescott following her, even when he was nowhere in sight. She told herself she would bring everything to Ellis tomorrow morning, but tonight she needed to do something more. She needed to see for herself what lay behind that newly sealed door in the basement of St. Michael's Church. The streets were empty as she drove back toward the church, her headlights cutting long shadows across the pavement, the rhythm of the windshield wipers the only sound in the car as a light rain began to fall, misting the windshield with a fine silver sheen. The town she had known all her life seemed transformed in the darkness, each familiar house and storefront taking on a new, menacing shape beneath the cold glow of the streetlights. She parked a block away from the church, not wanting her car seen too close to the site of whatever secrets lay buried beneath those limestone walls, and walked the last distance in silence, her footsteps soft on the wet pavement. The side door of the church was still unlocked, just as it had been before, and she slipped inside like a shadow, the faint scent of incense and wax greeting her as she closed the door behind her. She paused for a moment, listening to the hush of the nave above, the soft creak of old wood settling, the quiet of a place meant for prayer, now the setting for something far darker. Her breath quickened as she made her way to the stairway door, her fingers brushing over the ancient wood before she slipped the brass key from her pocket and turned it in the lock. The door swung open without a sound, revealing the narrow stone staircase that spiraled down into darkness. She descended slowly, one step at a time, the beam of her small flashlight flickering across the rough stone walls, the damp chill of the earth wrapping around her like a shroud. At the bottom, she found herself once more in the small chamber, the shelves of discarded hymnals and broken candlesticks, standing like silent witnesses to what had been hidden here. Her gaze went to the slab of stone in the center of the far wall, the crude mortar standing out like a scar against the older stones. She set the journals down on a dusty shelf, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she ran her hands over the stone, feeling for any crack, any weakness. She pressed her ear to the cold surface, listening for the hollow thump of empty space beyond. And when she heard it, a soft echo, a promise of something hidden, she felt a surge of grim determination. She pulled a small chisel and hammer from her jacket pocket, tools she had grabbed from James's old workbench in the garage, a memory of nights spent watching him mend things that no one else could fix. She set the chisel to the mortar and tapped it carefully, each blow echoing through the chamber like a secret heartbeat. The mortar cracked, flaking away in dusty shards as she worked methodically, her arms shaking with the effort, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cold. When at last she had loosened enough of the stone to pry it away, she paused, her breath catching as she set the chisel down and pushed against the slab with all her strength. It shifted with a low groan, revealing a narrow gap, and the smell that wafted out was the same damp, musty earthiness she had smelled before, tinged with something older, something that made her skin prickle. She slipped through the gap, the beam of her flashlight slicing through the darkness to reveal a hidden passageway, narrow and low-ceilinged, the walls lined with rough-hewn stone that glistened with moisture. She moved forward carefully, the air growing colder with each step, her breath misting in the beam of light. The passageway twisted and turned, and as she moved deeper, the oppressive weight of the earth above her seemed to press down, the silence so complete it was almost a physical thing. She had no idea how far the passage went, how deep it burrowed beneath the church, but she pressed on, driven by the memory of James's words, the names in his journals, the knowledge that somewhere in these depths lay the answers she had been seeking. The passage ended at another door, this one older, its wood blackened with age and moisture, iron hinges crusted with rust. She hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch, her mind screaming at her to turn back even as her heart urged her forward. She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, and the smell of earth and rot flooded out to meet her, making her gag. She raised her flashlight and stepped inside, and what she saw stole the breath from her lungs. The small chamber beyond was lined with shelves, each one holding row upon row of boxes, wooden crates and metal containers, their labels faded and illegible. In the center of the room stood an old wooden table, and on it, a map of Maple Creek, its edges curling and stained with age. She stepped closer, her light catching on the pins stuck into the map, red and black, each one marking a location she knew by heart. The church, the old freight yard, the town hall. And there, in the center of it all, a single red pin marked the crypt in the old cemetery. The crypt where she had always taken flowers on James's birthday, never knowing what lay beneath. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she realized what she was seeing. A map of a conspiracy, a plan that had reached into every corner of the town she loved. She turned slowly, her light catching on a small, battered safe tucked into the corner, its door slightly ajar. She knelt, her hands shaking as she pulled it open, and inside she found a stack of papers, yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. Names, dates, payments. Each page a testament to the darkness that had festered in Maple Creek for decades. She felt a cold calm settle over her as she tucked the papers into her jacket, her mind already racing ahead to how she would show them to Detective Ellis, how she would finally tear down the web that had ensnared her family and so many others. As she turned to leave, the beam of her flashlight caught something else, something that made her breath hitch in her throat. In the far corner of the room, a small bedroll lay on the dirt floor, and beside it, a child's toy. Emily's favorite stuffed bear, worn and dirty, its button eyes staring up at her in the dim light. Sarah fell to her knees, her hands reaching out to clutch the bear to her chest as tears welled in her eyes. Emily. She was here, or had been. She forced herself to stand, to wipe the tears from her cheeks and steel her resolve. She would find her daughter. She would bring her home. She turned and slipped back through the passageway, the weight of the stolen papers and the stuffed bear a promise and a vow. Outside, the rain fell harder, the night pressing close around the church as she emerged into the cold air. She didn't look back as she ran to her car, the journals, the papers, and the bear clutched to her chest. The secrets of Maple Creek were no longer buried, and she would see them all brought to light. The rain was coming down in sheets now, drumming on the roof of Sarah's car as she drove through the dark streets of Maple Creek, the windshield wipers working overtime to keep the road visible. The stuffed bear lay on the seat beside her, its worn fur matted with dirt, a silent witness to the secrets she had uncovered. The papers she had taken from the hidden room were tucked safely in her jacket, each one a piece of the puzzle that had consumed her life for 8 long years. She gripped the steering wheel tighter as she turned onto Main Street, her mind replaying every word she had read in James's journals, every name, every date. She thought of Alan Prescott, of the way he had looked at her in the police station, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes betraying a flicker of something darker. She thought of Officer Hank Jones, his too smooth reassurances, and the way his hand had lingered on her shoulder when he spoke of helping. And she thought of Emily, her sweet girl, lost and alone in the darkness for so long. As she approached the small diner on the corner of Main and Pine, she saw the soft glow of its neon sign, the only spot of warmth in the cold, rain-slicked night. She pulled into the lot and shut off the engine, taking a moment to steady her breathing. The diner had always been a safe place, a refuge during long nights and longer days. She needed that now, if only for a few minutes. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of coffee and frying bacon. The waitress, a woman named Marcy, who had known Sarah since she was a child, gave her a tired smile. "Rough night, hon?" she asked as she poured her a cup of coffee. "You could say that," Sarah replied, wrapping her cold hands around the mug. She didn't stay long, just enough time to collect her thoughts, to gather the strength she would need for what came next. When she stepped back into the night, the rain had eased to a gentle drizzle, the storm's fury spent. She slid back into her car and pulled the small brass key from her pocket, turning it over and over in her hand. The symbol carved into its head, the Cairo, seemed to glow faintly in the light of the street lamps, a silent promise of the door it had opened and the secrets it had revealed. She didn't go home. She couldn't. The thought of her empty house, of the memories that lingered in every corner, was too much to bear. Instead, she drove to the small motel on the edge of town, the one she and James had stayed at once during a storm years ago when their power went out. The clerk barely looked up as he handed her a key, and she was grateful for that small mercy. Inside the room, she locked the door behind her and sat on the edge of the bed, the papers spread out around her like a map of betrayal. Names she had known all her life stared up at her. Neighbors, friends, men who had once patted Emily's head and called her Princess. And at the center of it all, Alan Prescott's name, written in James's careful hand, underlined twice. The journals confirmed what she had long suspected. Alan had been working with the Reynosa cartel, using his position to grant them licenses and cover their shipments. The money had flowed like water, dirty, tainted, and leaving a stain on everything it touched. James had tried to stop it. He had gathered evidence, made copies of everything, but before he could act, he and Emily had disappeared. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the last entry in James's journal, dated just days before he vanished. "They're coming for me," he had written. "I've hidden the evidence where they'll never find it. If you're reading this, Sarah, know that I did it all for you and for Emily. I'm sorry." She closed the journal, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time in 8 years, she understood the weight James had carried, the fear he must have felt every day. She wiped her eyes and gathered the papers into a neat stack, tucking them back into her jacket. She would take them to Detective Ellis in the morning, but tonight she needed to rest, if only for a few hours. She lay back on the bed, the stuffed bear clutched to her chest, and let the exhaustion of the past day wash over her. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought of Emily, of the small voice that had whispered "Mom" in the darkness, and she made herself a promise. She would bring her daughter home. No matter what it cost her, no matter how deep the secrets went, she would not stop until Emily was safe. and as the rain fell softly against the window, Sarah Carter slept for the first time in years, her dreams filled with shadows and the distant echo of a child's laughter. The first light of dawn crept through the thin curtains of the motel room, pale and uncertain, as Sarah Carter woke to the muffled sounds of the highway beyond. For a moment, she lay still, the scent of stale coffee and damp carpet grounding her in the present, a small mercy after the nightmares that had filled her sleep. She rose slowly, every muscle aching from the tension of the day before, and splashed cold water on her face in the small bathroom sink. In the cracked mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her, eyes dark with exhaustion, lips pressed into a thin line of resolve. She had no illusions about the fight that lay ahead, no illusions about the danger that still waited in the shadows of Maple Creek. She dressed in jeans and a worn jacket, tucking the journals and the stack of damning papers into a battered canvas tote, the stuffed bear she left on the bed, a silent promise that she would come back for it, and for Emily. She drove back into town as the sun rose behind the clouds, the streets still quiet, the air holding the clean scent of rain and earth. The police station loomed ahead, squat and solid in the morning light. She parked and took a deep breath before stepping inside, the cold weight of the papers in her bag, a comfort and a burden. The desk sergeant was a different face this morning, Officer Ramirez, a young woman with steady eyes and a calm voice. "Detective Ellis is in," she said when Sarah asked. "He's been waiting for you." Sarah followed her down the hall, her heart pounding with each step. The door to Ellis's office was ajar, and he looked up as she entered, his weathered face creasing into a look of relief. "Sarah," he said, rising from his chair, "I was worried when you left last night. Are you all right?" She nodded, setting the tote on the edge of his desk. "I found something," she said simply, her voice steady despite the hammering of her pulse. "In the basement of St. Michael's. A hidden room, a map, papers, names, payments, everything James was trying to stop." Ellis's expression darkened as she spoke, his jaw tightening. "Show me," he said. She pulled out the papers, spreading them across his desk, each sheet a thread in the web of corruption that had ensnared her family and her town. She told him everything, the journals, the key, the cryptic map that had led her to the heart of the conspiracy. She told him about Alan Prescott, about the men who had watched her from the shadows, about the stuffed bear that had once belonged to Emily. Ellis listened in silence, his fingers drumming a slow, steady rhythm against the edge of the desk. When she finished, he sat back, his eyes thoughtful. "This is enough to open an investigation," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. "More than enough. I'll need to make copies, get warrants. This is going to ruffle a lot of feathers, Sarah." She met his gaze, her shoulders straight. "I don't care about feathers," she said. "I care about my daughter, about what they did to James. I want them exposed, all of them." Ellis nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "You'll have it," he promised, "but you need to be careful. If they know you have this—" "They already do," she interrupted softly. "They tried to take it from me last night. They failed." Ellis's expression hardened, and he rose from his chair. "I'm assigning an officer to watch your house," he said. "I'll have Martinez take the first shift." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not going home," she said. "Not until this is over." Ellis considered her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But promise me you'll stay in touch. If you see anything at all, call me, no matter the hour." "I promise," she said. She left the station with a new sense of purpose, the weight of the past 8 years no longer a chain around her neck, but a weapon in her hand. She would find Emily. She would see James's name cleared, and she would watch Maple Creek's secrets burn in the light of day. As she stepped out into the brightening morning, Sarah Carter felt the first fragile flicker of hope take root in her chest. The battle was only beginning, but for the first time in years, she knew she wasn't alone. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky as Sarah Carter left the police station, the cold autumn air crisp against her skin, the streets of Maple Creek stirring to life around her. She walked quickly, her steps purposeful, her mind focused on the task ahead. She knew there was no turning back now, not after what she had uncovered in the darkness of St. Michael's Church. She stopped at a small cafe on the corner of Main and Cedar, the warm scent of fresh bread and coffee wrapping around her as she stepped inside. She ordered a cup of black coffee and took a seat by the window, her back to the wall so she could watch the street. The cafe was nearly empty. just a few early risers lingering over their breakfast, the quiet murmur of conversation, a soft counterpoint to the thundering of her thoughts. She pulled James's journal from her bag, flipping it open to the last few entries she had read the night before. Each word felt like a lifeline, each sentence a testament to the man he had been, the man they had tried to silence. She could see him in her mind's eye, his strong hands gripping the pen, the quiet determination in his eyes as he wrote down the names of those who had betrayed him. Alan Prescott, Hank Jones, names she had known all her life, men she had once trusted. Now she saw them for what they were, cowards hiding behind polite smiles and empty promises. She sipped her coffee, her eyes scanning the street beyond the window. She knew they would come for her again. She could feel it in the cold knot of fear that settled in her stomach, in the way every shadow seemed to flicker with unseen movement. But she was ready. She wouldn't be caught off guard again. She closed the journal and slipped it back into her bag, her hand brushing against the small brass key she had carried with her since she found it. The symbol on its head seemed to burn against her palm, a silent reminder of the door it had opened and the secrets it had revealed. She thought of the map in the hidden room, the red pins that marked the crypt in the old cemetery, the final piece of the puzzle, the place where the past and the present converged. She would go there tonight, she decided. She would see for herself what lay beneath the earth, what truths still waited to be uncovered in the darkness. She rose from the table, leaving a few bills beneath her cup, and stepped back out into the chill of the late morning. The sun was warm on her face, but the shadows felt colder now, sharper, as if the town itself was holding its breath. She walked back to her car, her fingers tight around the strap of her bag, her eyes scanning every doorway, every passing car. She knew she couldn't trust anyone, not until she had the answers she needed, not until she had Emily back. As she drove away from the cafe, Sarah felt the weight of the past 8 years settle around her like a mantle, heavy but no longer suffocating. She was done being afraid. She was done waiting for someone else to save her. She would face whatever lay ahead, and she would not back down. That afternoon, Sarah parked her car a block away from the old cemetery, her hands resting on the wheel as she stared out at the rusted iron gate that marked the entrance. The overgrown grass swayed in the wind, the tall headstones casting long, jagged shadows in the waning light. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. The sun was already beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, the sky streaked with bruised clouds that promised another night of rain. She slipped the brass key from her pocket, the symbol on its head catching the last rays of sunlight, and stepped out into the cold. She walked quickly, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth, her breath fogging in the chill air. The caretaker's cottage was dark, the windows shuttered, no sign of the man who had watched over these graves for so many years. She slipped past it, her gaze fixed on the crypt that stood like a silent sentinel at the heart of the cemetery, the Blackwood Crypt. She had been there so many times before, laying flowers on James's birthday, whispering prayers for Emily. But tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't there to mourn. She was there to uncover the truth. She slipped the key into the lock, her fingers trembling as it turned with a soft click. The heavy door swung open on silent hinges, the cold air of the crypt washing over her like a shroud. She stepped inside, her small flashlight cutting through the darkness in thin, trembling slices. The walls were lined with burial niches, each one marked with a name, a date, a story long forgotten. She moved deeper, her footsteps echoing softly in the silence, her breath shallow in her chest. At the far end of the crypt, she found the door she had seen in the hidden passageway beneath the church. The same crude mortar, the same faint scent of earth and secrets. She pressed her hand against it, feeling for the hollow spaces beneath the stone, and began to work. The chisel bit into the mortar with a soft, steady rhythm, each tap of the hammer echoing like a heartbeat in the darkness. She worked quickly, methodically, the sweat of fear and determination slick on her brow. When at last the stone shifted, she pushed it aside and slipped into the narrow passage beyond. The air was colder here, damp and heavy with the weight of the earth above. She moved forward slowly, her flashlight beam flickering across the rough walls, her ears straining for any sound that wasn't her own. And then she heard it, a soft sob, so faint she almost thought she imagined it. Her heart lurched in her chest, her hands shaking as she called out softly, "Emily?" The sobbing stopped, replaced by a ragged, hitching breath. "Mom?" The voice was so small, so broken, but it was her daughter's voice. Sarah's knees gave out, tears spilling down her cheeks as she crawled forward, her flashlight shaking in her trembling hands. She found her in a small chamber at the end of the passage, huddled in a corner, her thin arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes huge and hollow in the dim light. "Emily," she sobbed, gathering her daughter into her arms, holding her as tightly as she dared. "I'm here, baby, I'm here." Emily clung to her, her small body shaking with silent sobs. "Don't let them take me again," she whispered. "Please, Mom, don't let them take me." "I won't," Sarah promised, her voice fierce and steady. "I swear to you, Emily, I won't let anyone hurt you again." She held her daughter close, her heart breaking at the feel of bones beneath skin, at the haunted look in her eyes. She didn't know how long they stayed there, wrapped in each other's arms, but when she finally looked up, she saw the brass key glinting in the dirt at her feet, the same key that had opened the door to this nightmare, and to the hope that now flickered in her chest. She knew the battle wasn't over. She knew Alan Prescott and his shadows wouldn't give up without a fight, but she had found her daughter, and for the first time in 8 years, Sarah Carter knew what she was fighting for. Sarah held Emily in the cold silence of the crypt, her breath shallow as she tried to calm the storm of fear and relief inside her. She could feel the girl's bones beneath her thin skin, the way her small hands clung to her jacket, as if to anchor herself to the world she'd been stolen from. She knew they couldn't stay there for long. Someone would come looking, and she couldn't risk losing Emily again. She pulled back just enough to look into her daughter's face, brushing a strand of matted hair from her forehead. "We're going to get you out of here," she whispered. "We're going to go home." Emily's eyes widened, hope warring with fear in their depths. "But he said if I left, he'd find me. He always finds me." Sarah's heart clenched, but she forced herself to smile, her voice steady. "I won't let him, Emily. I promise." She took a deep breath, the sound of dripping water echoing softly through the darkness as she scanned the small chamber one last time. She could see the faint scuff marks on the dirt floor, the signs of where Emily had been kept, the desperate claw marks near the door. Rage burned in her chest, but she pushed it down. There would be time for justice later. For now, she needed to get her daughter out. She slipped her jacket off and wrapped it around Emily's shoulders, holding her close as she retraced their path through the narrow passage. The way back felt longer, every shadow a threat, every sound making her breath catch in her throat. But when they emerged at last into the crypt, the faint glow of her flashlight catching the worn stone walls, she felt a surge of relief. She led Emily to the door of the crypt, pushing it open slowly, the night air cold and sharp against their skin. The cemetery was silent, the trees whispering overhead in the breeze, the ground damp beneath their feet as they stepped out into the darkness. Sarah moved quickly, guiding Emily down the path that led to the edge of the cemetery, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. She could feel the weight of the secrets she carried, the danger that still loomed, but she refused to let it slow her. When they reached the car, she opened the door and helped Emily into the passenger seat, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the seatbelt. "It's okay," she murmured, more to herself than to her daughter. "We're almost safe." She started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness as she pulled away from the cemetery gates. The town of Maple Creek lay quiet and still ahead of them, but Sarah knew the battle was far from over. She would take Emily to the police station, to Detective Ellis. She would show him the papers, the journals, everything she had found. She would not let Alan Prescott bury the truth any longer. As they drove through the sleeping town, Emily leaned her head against the window, her eyes half closed, exhaustion pulling at her small frame. Sarah reached over and squeezed her hand, her own eyes wet with tears she refused to let fall. "I love you, Emily," she said softly. "I'm so sorry it took me this long." Emily didn't answer, but she didn't let go of her hand, and as they turned onto the main road, the first faint glow of dawn broke over the horizon, a promise of light, of hope, and of a new beginning that had been a long time coming. The police station was quiet in the early morning light, the parking lot empty except for a few patrol cars glistening with dew. Sarah pulled up to the curb and killed the engine, her heart pounding as she looked at her daughter beside her. Emily's eyes were closed, her small body curled into the seat, exhaustion pulling her under in a restless sleep. For a moment, Sarah let herself just sit there, her hand resting on Emily's arm, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing, the faint pulse beneath her skin. Then she gathered her strength and stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at her skin as she walked around to the passenger side. She opened the door carefully, her voice gentle as she whispered, "Emily, honey, wake up. We're here." Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open, confusion and fear flickering across her face before she remembered. And then she reached for Sarah, her small hand clutching at her jacket. "I've got you," Sarah murmured, gathering her daughter into her arms and holding her close as she walked toward the front doors. Inside, the station was warm and bright, the faint scent of coffee and floor polish a comfort against the chill outside. Officer Ramirez was at the desk again, her calm eyes widening slightly as she saw them enter. "Mrs. Carter," she said, standing quickly. "Is this—" Sarah nodded, her voice steady. "This is Emily. I need to see Detective Ellis right now." Ramirez didn't ask any more questions. She just picked up the phone and murmured a few quiet words. Moments later, Ellis appeared at the doorway, his lined face tight with concern as his gaze fell on Emily. "My God," he breathed, stepping forward. "Sarah, is she—" "She's alive," Sarah said fiercely, her arms tightening around her daughter. "She's safe, but there's more, so much more. I found where they kept her, the papers James hid, everything. It's all in here." She shifted Emily carefully into a chair and pulled the stack of papers and journals from her bag, setting them on Ellis's desk with a thump that echoed in the quiet room. "I want them all brought down, Mark. Every last one of them." Ellis nodded, his eyes meeting hers with grim determination. "You have my word," he said quietly. "We'll start with this. We'll get her checked by the medics first, and then I'll call in the DA. No one's going to sweep this under the rug, Sarah." She watched as he carefully lifted the first journal, his eyes scanning the neat, looping handwriting that was so achingly familiar. In that moment, she felt a surge of something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Relief. She knelt beside Emily, brushing a hand over her tangled hair. "It's going to be okay now," she said softly. "We're going to be okay." Emily looked up at her, her eyes wide and dark in the harsh light of the station. "He said he'd come for me," she whispered. "He said he'd always find me." Sarah swallowed hard, her hand tightening on her daughter's. "He won't," she promised, her voice steel. "Not anymore." She rose and turned to Ellis, her chin lifting. "I want to be there when you arrest Alan Prescott," she said. "I want to see him face the truth." Ellis hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "You'll have that chance." Outside, the sun was fully risen now, painting the streets of Maple Creek in pale gold. But for Sarah, the light inside her was brighter than anything the dawn could offer. She had her daughter back. She had the truth in her hands, and she would see it through to the very end. The hours that followed were a blur of hushed conversations and flashing blue lights, of medics checking Emily's pulse, and police officers gathering around Ellis's desk as he read through the evidence Sarah had brought. She watched them work, her daughter's small hand wrapped tightly in hers, feeling the weight of every minute. Emily sat beside her, a blanket draped over her thin shoulders, her eyes following each movement in the station with wary curiosity. Sarah had to keep reminding herself that this was real, no longer the fog of nightmares and what-ifs that had haunted her every day for the past 8 years. "We're going to the hospital soon," Ellis said gently, kneeling in front of Emily with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just to make sure you're healthy. Then you'll be somewhere safe, I promise." Emily nodded once, her gaze dropping to the worn floor tiles. Sarah squeezed her hand. "I'll be with you every step of the way," she said softly. The journals lay open on the desk behind them, names and dates dancing across the pages in James's careful handwriting. Each line was a thread, weaving a picture of betrayal and blood money that reached into every corner of Maple Creek. "Alan Prescott won't be able to talk his way out of this," Ellis murmured as he straightened. "It's all here, the cartel connections, the payments, the orders to keep Emily hidden. He thought he was safe because no one had the courage to look deeper." "He didn't count on her," Sarah said, her voice low but fierce. She looked at Emily, who was watching her with wide, wondering eyes. "He didn't count on us." An hour later, they were in the back of a police SUV, lights flashing as they drove across town to City Hall. Ellis sat in the passenger seat, his phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with officers already on site. Sarah held Emily close, her daughter's small frame trembling with every jolt of the car. "It's okay," she whispered over and over, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince, Emily or herself. The SUV pulled up in front of the Grand Limestone Building, the place where James had once stood so proudly to take his oath of office. Now, it loomed dark and silent, the weight of its history pressing down on them. Officers moved purposefully across the steps, their radios crackling softly in the still air. "Stay here," Ellis said, glancing back at Sarah. "I need to talk to Alan before we bring you inside." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I need to be there. He needs to see that he didn't break us." Ellis hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. "All right," he said quietly, "but stay behind me." They walked up the steps together, the heavy wooden doors swinging open to reveal the marble foyer beyond. Alan Prescott stood at the far end, his polished shoes glinting in the dim light, his expression calm and controlled. But as his eyes met Sarah's, something flickered in the depths, something dark and uncertain. "Sarah," he said smoothly, his voice soft, "I heard you found Emily. I'm so relieved, truly." "Don't," she spat, her hand tightening on Emily's shoulder. "Don't you dare pretend you cared." Ellis stepped forward, his badge glinting on his belt. "Alan Prescott, you're under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice," he said, in a voice that carried through the cavernous hall. Alan's mask didn't slip completely, but Sarah saw it crack, just for a moment, a flicker of rage in his eyes. "You think you've won," he said softly, his gaze shifting to Emily. "You think this changes everything." Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. "I know it does." As the officers led Alan away, his hands bound in silver cuffs, Sarah felt a weight lift from her chest. She turned to Emily, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We did it," she said, her voice breaking with relief. "We're free." Outside, the wind stirred the leaves in the trees, the first hint of a coming storm. But in that moment, standing in the grand hall where James's dreams had once lived, Sarah felt nothing but light. They stepped back out into the cold, the sky above them bruised with gathering clouds that seemed to mirror the turmoil Sarah felt inside. Emily clung to her hand, her small fingers tight around Sarah's, her eyes scanning every shadow with wary uncertainty. "It's over now," Sarah murmured, though the words felt fragile on her tongue. "He can't hurt you anymore." Emily looked up at her, her dark eyes wide and searching, and for a moment Sarah saw a flicker of the little girl she had once been, the child who had run through sunlit fields, her laughter bright and unbroken. "I'm scared, Mom," Emily whispered. "What if he comes back? What if he finds us again?" Sarah knelt beside her, her hands cupping Emily's cold cheeks, her heart breaking at the haunted look in her daughter's eyes. "He won't," she said fiercely. "I promise you, Emily, he will never touch you again." She pressed her forehead to Emily's, closing her eyes as she drew a deep breath. Around them, the police cars and the murmured conversations of officers seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them in the cold, still air. When she pulled back, she saw a small spark of trust in Emily's eyes, flickering, but there. Detective Ellis appeared beside them, his face grave but resolute. "We're taking Alan to a secure holding facility," he said quietly. "He won't be able to pull any strings this time, and we'll get you both someplace safe, away from all of this." Sarah nodded, the weight of everything she had carried for so long pressing down on her shoulders. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me, for believing us." Ellis's expression softened. "I've seen enough to know the truth," he said, "and I promise you, Sarah, this isn't the end. We're going to make sure everyone who helped him pays for what they did." The drive to the safe house was quiet, the rain beginning to fall in gentle sheets that blurred the world outside the windows. Emily dozed in the back seat, her head resting against Sarah's shoulder, and for the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to hope. The safe house was a small cabin on the edge of town, surrounded by tall pines and the hush of the forest. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, a soft green scent that felt like a balm to her ragged nerves. Inside, it was warm and bright, the glow of the fireplace flickering across the wooden walls. Emily curled up on the small couch, wrapped in a thick quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. Sarah sat beside her, one hand resting on her daughter's shoulder, the other clutching James's journal against her chest. She read the last entry again and again, her fingers tracing the careful lines of his handwriting, feeling the weight of his love and his fear in every word. She thought of the hidden room beneath the church, the map of Maple Creek, and the secrets it had revealed. She thought of the men who had looked her in the eye and lied, who had tried to bury the truth beneath layers of fear and silence. And she thought of Emily, of the way her daughter's eyes had met hers in the darkness, of the strength she had found in that small, trembling hand. "We're going to start over," she whispered into the quiet of the cabin. "We're going to find a way to be whole again." Emily stirred beside her, her eyes opening slowly. "Do you believe that, Mom?" she asked in a small voice. Sarah looked down at her, her heart swelling with fierce protective love. "I have to," she said. "For you. For both of us." Outside, the storm gathered strength, the wind sighing through the trees like a promise. But inside the small cabin, there was warmth and light, and the quiet heartbeat of hope. The storm raged through the night, the wind howling through the tall pines that surrounded the cabin, rain lashing the windows like cold fingers. Sarah lay awake beside Emily, her daughter's thin arm curled around her waist. The slow rhythm of her breathing, a quiet reassurance in the dark. She kept her eyes on the flickering shadows thrown by the dying fire, every creak of the old cabin, a reminder of how close the world outside still felt. But inside, wrapped in the scent of cedar and the warmth of the quilt, she felt something she hadn't known in years, a fragile, precious sense of safety. When dawn finally broke, it did so in a soft hush of pale light filtering through the trees. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and glistening in the gentle gold of the morning sun. Sarah rose quietly, careful not to wake Emily, and stepped outside into the cool, damp air. The world smelled of wet earth and pine needles, a scent that filled her lungs with every breath. She stood for a long moment on the small porch, the journals and papers she had brought stacked safely inside. The weight of them felt different now, less like a burden, more like a promise. She thought of James, of the strength she had found in his words, the way his careful handwriting had guided her through the darkness. She thought of the girl still sleeping inside, of the way her eyes had met hers in the crypt, and how, in that moment, she had known that nothing, not fear, not violence, not the shadows of the past, could ever break that bond. Detective Ellis arrived just after sunrise, his unmarked car crunching softly on the gravel drive. He stepped out and gave her a small nod, his eyes calm and steady. "We've got everything we need," he said. "Alan Prescott and everyone who helped him. They're not going to walk away from this. The DA's office is already drawing up charges." Sarah nodded, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Ellis's expression softened. "It was you, Sarah. You and Emily. You were the ones who wouldn't let them hide what they did." He paused, then added, "What's next for you two?" She looked back at the cabin, at the small window where she could see the edge of the quilt where Emily still slept. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we're going to take it one day at a time, one morning at a time." Ellis nodded. "If you need anything, protection, help finding a new start, just say the word. We're here for you." "I know," she said. "Thank you." He left soon after, driving back toward town as the sun climbed higher, the gold of the morning brightening the world around her. She went back inside and found Emily awake, sitting up with the quilt wrapped around her shoulders, her dark hair tangled and her eyes bright. "Is it really over?" she asked in a small voice. Sarah sat beside her and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Yes," she said firmly. "It's over. And it's our turn now, Emily. Our turn to live." They spent the rest of the day together, Sarah reading from the journals in the warm light of the fire, Emily curled against her side. Outside, the world felt different, new somehow, as if the storm had washed away not just the darkness of the night, but the weight of the past itself. When evening came and the sky turned a soft rose gold above the trees, Sarah stepped outside once more, the cool breeze brushing her cheeks. She closed her eyes and breathed in deep, the clean air filling her lungs, the promise of a new day filling her heart, and she knew, truly knew, that no matter what came next, they would face it together. They had survived the darkness. Now they would step into the light. In the final breath of the storm, Sarah Carter stood at the threshold of a new life, a life no longer defined by fear or shadow, but by the fierce light of truth she had reclaimed. The echoes of the past would never fully fade, But in the quiet strength of her daughter's hand in hers, she found the promise of tomorrow. Maple Creek had been a town of whispers and half-truths, but now it stood as a testament to the power of a mother's love and the indomitable courage it could awaken. This is more than a story of secrets. It is a story of survival, of redemption, and of the unbreakable bond between those who refuse to be forgotten. If this journey moved you, share your thoughts below, and let the world know. Every truth deserves to be heard.